Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Allawi, Chapter 6, Territory and Power. From the very outset, Muslim civilization was built on foundations supplied by the ideology alone. It has never had anything to do with the concepts of race or nation. Ours has always been an ideological civilization, with the law of the Quran as its source and, more than that, as its only historical justification. To speak of the Muslim Ummah as something politically justified or culturally valuable, and in the same breath to question the importance of Islamic law as the form giving element in our life, is hypocritical or alternatively an outcome of ignorance. Muhammad Asad, writer and essayist, This Law of Ours and Other Essays, Darul Andalus, Gibraltar, 1993. The famous Clash of Civilizations thesis glossed over an issue of singular importance. Of all the great civilizations of the world, it was only Islam that had no state champions who could act out their role on the global stage. The West was amply championed by the United States as well as by the countries of the Western Europe, directly or through the EU. The Hindu world was practically contiguous with the subcontinent state of India. Confucianism was terminus with China. Even orthodoxy was championed by the new Russian state built on the debris of the former Soviet Union. Each of these states could embody and defend the principles of their civilization and had the necessary resources concentrated in a few powerful nation states to be able to do so. Only Islam lacked the essential core state advocate or empire, which might singly or with a few allies be able to defend its interests and values without reference to other powers. It is ironic, therefore, that whenever Islam was singled out as the main protagonist in the clash of civilizations, little notice was taken of the disproportionate power between Islamic states in their fragmented and disjointed nature and the large state actors of the other civilizations. The collective organizations of Muslim states were never a match in terms of will, purpose, or power to the large state actors of other civilizations. Sense of Islamic territorial power. The destruction of the last Islamic empire put paid to the possibility of a large, well-resourced state emerging as a replacement power for the Ottomans. Elsewhere, when non-Western civilizations came under foreign control, the post-colonial order still allowed for the formation of superstates. China regained its territorial unity with the exception of Taiwan after the victory of the communists in 1949. India, even after the division from which Pakistan and later Bangladesh emerged, kept most of its territory and the vast majority of world's Hindus. But the successor states to the last Muslim empires were not reconfigured as large units. The chimerical drive to unity attempted by the Arabs in the 1950s and 1960s was never a real substitute in the Islamic terms for the dissolved Ottoman Empire. The largest Arab state, Egypt, was far too poor and weak to be a serious champion for Islam and the Muslim causes. Pakistan abandoned any claim to playing a role in this regard, preoccupied as it was with the threats of war or with actual wars with India. Iran, after its 1979 revolution, tried to carve a role for itself as the defender of Islam, but its Shia identity limited its appeal and influence on the wider stage. Islamic civilization was decoupled from large states and empires that could effectively embody and defend its message. Samuel P. Huntington called this condition consciousness without cohesion. Ever since, Islamic civilization has been in search of a paladin. For a while, this condition was of minor significance. The world was defined by conflicts other than the supposed clash of civilizations. During the Cold War period, the absence of an Islamic core state was not material to the standoff between the West and the Soviet bloc. The West and the Soviets sought allies from individual Muslim states and not from Islam as such. While the West in its propaganda chose to draw Islam into its orbit by emphasizing the godlessness of the communists, Muslim leaders who had allied themselves with the Soviets were focusing on the virtues of Islamic socialism and on its proximity to the egalitarian doctrines of communism and collectivism. The collapse of the Soviet bloc and the ethnic wars of the 1990s, in which Muslims were disproportionately involved, raised the specter of a worldwide pan-Islamic movement bent on creating a new Muslim empire. Public opinion in the Western world was agitated by garbled notions of what the Ummah of Islam actually meant. The pan-Islamic calls for jihad by Bin Laden were mixed up with the widespread concern that a radical Islam superstate, a boogeyman of an Islamic caliphate, could arise. This state would lay a prior claim on the world's Muslim, especially in the West. The notion of an empire inspired by a world religion was not an only alien, but quite frightening, not only to the Westerners, but also to the huge numbers of countries which abutted on the Muslim world. Part of the problem related to the vast geographic spread of Islam, which covered the middle belt of the Asian landmass, a good part of Africa, and footholds inside Europe itself. A universal empire which might be territorially contiguous with the reach of Islam would be an incredible prospect. In fact, no such empire could ever be stable except for very short periods of time. It would probably crumble as the peripheral parts pulled away. Although it's an unrealistic fantasy, the fear of such a state ever emerging has had a powerful hold on the imagination of people, both on its proponents and its detractors. Pan-Islamism was used to bolster the authority of the Ottoman Empire in its last decade and was in fact state policy under Sultan Abdul Hamid. It never amounted to much apart from the scattered and ineffectual involvement of the Ottoman Empire on behalf of beleaguered Muslims or Muslim causes outside its territorial control. It had a brief flurry of life in the 1920s when it provided the ideological fervor the Indian Khilafat movement and attracted a number of peripatetic individuals such as the Lebanese prince Saqib Arsalan, who tried to promote the idea of Muslim political unity. It emerged again, but in a totally different guise in the 1990s, this time being allied to the rise of transnational Islamist movements. Some of these, for instance, Hizb ut-Tahrir, which has established itself as a formidable movement in Central Asia, had an explicit pan-Islamic ideology and called for the establishment of a new Islamic caliphate. One of the side effects of the clash of civilizations theory, which was first advanced in 1991 by Bernard Lewis, the eminent historian of Islam, was to place Islam at odds with a coherent state structure through which other civilizations appeared to function. Islam was the perpetual outsider whose political manifestations would be disruptive and destabilizing to the prevailing world order. On the other hand, the prospects of Islamic unity would be dangerous if unity were to lead to the formation of a large political entities which might be widely spread geographically or might dispose of considerable resources. On the other hand, it was assumed that Muslims were alienated from the very countries in which they lived because their consciousness as Muslims did not square with the demands of loyalty to the nation state. This was an issue for Muslim diasporas in the West as well as for disaffected, radicalized youth in a number of predominantly Muslim countries. The terms of Islam's encounter with the world's power structures changed once again after the 9/11 attacks. The Clash of Civilizations thesis, after its heyday in the 1990s, was replaced by the War on Terror and assertion of the US's singular status as the world's hyperpower, the so-called unipolar world theory. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists, said George W. Bush. For individual Muslim countries, the choice was stark. Most, of course, succumbed to the threats or brandishments of the US and, recognizing their powerlessness in front of America, accepted whatever they were told they should do. In a celebrated altercation between Pakistan's intelligence director and Richard Armitage, the Deputy Secretary of State, following the 9/11 attacks, Pakistan was threatened with oblivion if it did not toe the line. Armitage was reported to have warned the intelligence director, "Be prepared to be bombed. Be prepared to go back to the Stone Age." Bullying Muslim states was easy enough. There was no Muslim state or states which singly or collectively rose to the status of a world-class power and which would challenge the world war on terror. The war against terror was really a war against Islam itself, reinforcing its outer status in the constellation of states and civilizations. The residue of hostility, suspicion, and fear of Islam had not disappeared from the Western mind, and it could easily be dredged up to stiffen the charge that Islam as a whole was the culprit. One of the agendas of war on terror, therefore, was the Western-led drive to reform and reconstruct Islam, even though none of the Muslim states could pose any serious military threat to the US. Although Islam no longer had a territorial power base of any consequence, it still could rely on the loyalty of millions of Muslims to the idea of Islam and on their willingness to spring to its defense if it was threatened. The goal of the West's campaign was to adjust the Muslims' understanding of Islam so that it could fall into line with the global order dominated by the precepts of liberal democracies. But the US is no longer as omnipotent as it was in the decade after the fall of the Soviet bloc. The world order is still evolving. Now, no single power predominates. US power is in retreat, partly due to the overreach of the war on terror and also to the vast expenditures necessary to sustain its hyperpower status. The rise of non-Western powers such as China, which do not share the West's preoccupation with reforming Islam, has removed the reformation of Islam as a global objective. In this multipolar world, Islam is once again the outsider. The larger nation-states of Islam, such as Egypt, Turkey, or Indonesia, are not viewed as nodes of possible power in their own right, but as prizes for actual or evolving power structure. In this changing world, the US has to face challenges from an expanding EU and a mercantilist China, each of which is determined to develop a network of allies and clients from the roster of countries which are doomed or destined to dependency. These countries are drawn irresistibly into the larger orbits, partly for economic development reasons and partly for security. The strategy, therefore, for Muslim states is to maneuver between these three power blocks or to commit to one of them and extract whatever advantage they can for themselves and their people. Thus, Morocco would naturally fit into the expanding EU, given its trade links with Europe and the presence of a large number of its migrants there. At the same time, Morocco could become more integrated or perhaps more dependent on the EU as it becomes an important retirement destination for elderly Europeans attracted by its proximity, its lower costs, and its abundant labor for personal service. Indonesia will fit into an expanding Chinese economic zone, with its diaspora Chinese population playing an important part in its economic development and drawing it nearer to China. Power and consciousness. This state of affairs is a bitter pill for many Muslims to swallow. The powerlessness of Islam in a world bestridden by large states, core states, hyperpowers, and emerging giants is too obvious not to merit attention. Practically every configuration of the global power equation over the past century has been expressed in terms which take no account of Islam as a relevant political force, except, of course, when Islam is connected to a threat such as international terrorism or the unassimilability of Muslim minorities. For a large percentage of Muslims, loyalty to Islam is not restricted to the religious sphere. Apart from the special case of Judaism, adherents of the other major religions do not equate their religious faith with the political community. In Islam, the loss of territorial empires has not been matched by the complete displacement of Muslim loyalties in favor of the nation state. Islamic political unity, no matter how chimerical or utopian, continues to exert powerful political appeal. This transnational but invisible bond which connects the world of Islam is in itself a type of virtual empire, an empire of consciousness. It has no equivalent in the real political world. Were such a state or such a grouping of states to emerge, it would probably be resisted as dangerously destabilizing for the global order, as well as for smaller Muslim states who survive under the protective wing of the larger powers. In fact, the opposite ought to be the case. It is the absence of any formal and substantial Islamic political presence at the global level that contributes to instability and disorder. But the association of Islam with fanaticism and violence is deeply rooted in the psyche of Westerners. It has also become a boogeyman to Hindu fundamentalists who have succeeded in demonizing its presence in India in the minds of millions of that country's aspiring middle classes. There is no doubt that the prevailing sentiment of hostility towards Islam and Muslims informs the calculations of the policy planners. The world's power brokers have persisted in denying the legitimacy or desirability of a potential new force which could provide some coherence to the political expression of Islam as a civilization. The frantic drive to contain the aftershocks of the Iranian Islamic Revolution and the impact on other Muslim countries is a case in point. The Western powers worked with the established Middle Eastern autocracies and dictatorships to stop the infection from the revolution spreading. It was much the same as European monarchical powers striving to snuff out the effects of the French Revolution. Fragmentation and dependency is a more acceptable condition for Islamic states as far as the West is concerned. The last thing they want is the risks in dealing with the formidable new Muslim political power. The permanent disempowerment of Islam by freezing it out from the international system is somehow conducive to stability because of Islam's problematic nature or because of its inherent tendency to violence and disruption is, at best, questionable. This ostracizing increases rather than contains the sense of alienation which infects a large proportion of the youth in the Muslim world as well as the radical Muslim fringe in the West. This is further exacerbated by the widespread belief that most Muslim rulers are hopelessly compromised by their dependence on the West and are therefore unlikely to defend Islam and Muslim interests. They are seen either to be colluding with the reigning powers or to be too indifferent or powerless to influence the treatment of Islam and Muslims in the world. The cooperation of many Muslim countries with the legally questionable US policy of rendition terror suspects is a case in point. The defense of the human and legal rights of the suspects is left to the Western lawyers and agencies. No Muslim government has directly challenged the US on this matter, even when its own citizens have been involved. How can this be anything other than weak or craven collaboration? So far, the main concern has been to limit the growth of Islamic states, that is, governments whose institutions and laws are derived from the versions of Islamist ideologies. These are judged to be confrontational, radical, and disruptive, if not to the global order, then at least to the regional stability. The pan-Islamic pretensions of such states may push them to claim extraterritorial rights, moral if not legal, to intervene on behalf of beleaguered Muslim minorities or even in the internal affairs of other Muslim countries. The drive to contain Iran and the isolation of Sudan reflect one aspect of this. Neither of these states has even remotely the potential of growing into the missing Islamic actor on the world stage. However, this is only one facet of the issue. In fact, the potential for forming Islamic states in the Muslim countries is determined primarily by local factors, such as the strength of the Islamist movement and the resilience and power of the governing order. And in spite of the formidable odds against them, Islamist groups, when they do succeed in achieving power, are soon bogged down in a minutiae of governing and remaining in power. They add very little as effective advocates for Muslims on the world stage and cannot contend with global powers on a reasonably equal footing. Global powers generally do not emerge as a result of a conscious design, although China, after the Deng reforms of the 1980s, was a planned venture into the global arena by a hitherto isolationist power. Global players evolve because of particular historical, social, and economic circumstances which allow them to realize great power status and to project their power onto the world stage. The few existing Islamic states have been unable to coalesce into anything powerful on the global stage. Power and stability. The world system is not based on equity and fairness, but the absence of these factors is a major source of instability and extremism. So far, there has been no support for a concert of Muslim countries that assumes a more assertive position on the international stage. The most likely such organization, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, OIC, has neither the mandate nor the desire to extend its reach beyond the pious calls for Islamic solidarity and infrequent and toothless statements of condemnation for particularly objectionable acts targeting Muslims or Islam. Its origin as a Saudi-sponsored Islamic counterweight to Nasser's Arab nationalism has never quite left its trace, nor are its members prepared to cede power and influence it. If there is to be an Islamic global power, it will have to be found elsewhere other than in the feeble multilateral Islamic organizations that actually exist. Not all Muslims would agree that to flourish Islamic civilization needs the protection of a powerful state. A Muslim state's open embrace of Islam and Islamic causes is not only anathema to secularists, but can also lead to dangerous foreign entanglements and reaction. For example, a public Arab, Turkish, or Iranian espousal of the cause of Kashmiri Muslims will antagonize India, with which a number of these countries have vital relations. Nor was there much official protests from Muslim countries against the pogroms of Indian Muslims after the destruction of the Babri Mosque in 1992. The treatment of the Burma's Muslim minority, which accounts for nearly 10% of the population, by the military-dominated government has been appalling. According to the Human Rights Watch, Muslims have been barred from the army and from the government and suffer from severe discriminatory policies. But Indonesia and Malaysia, two countries where Muslims are the majority, both co-members together with Burma in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, would jeopardize their relations with the Burmese government over this matter if they were to protest, and they aren't prepared to go down that road. Cultural differences lie at the heart of the conflicts and struggles that underlie the clash of civilizations thesis. Religion is, of course, only one aspect of the civilization, but the religious inheritance is probably the most significant and salient characteristics of a civilization. Hence, Western civilization is underpinned by the Judeo-Christian tradition, even as the major Western powers are determinedly secular and liberal in their political culture. In a similar vein, China is the inheritor of the Confucian legacy, even though it is currently governed by a nominally atheistic communist state. Each civilizational group is assumed to have a number of key features and values which are then projected or protected by the core states of the group. In the last decade, the assertion of essential Western values by the major European powers and by the US, values that are supposed to determine Western civilization, what separates us from them, has frequently been made in contradistinction to radical Islam. In such a context, the affirmation of what the West is about obliges its adversaries or even peers to define themselves along equivalent civilizational lines. Thus, the Asian values propounded by the East and Southeast Asian countries, loyalty to family, hierarchy, order, and social discipline, are compared and contrasted with Western values, providing the Asian economic renaissance with the rootedness in the spiritual and religious traditions of Asia. No Muslim state has proclaimed that its adherence to Islamic norms of conduct and behavior has been the essential factor in its success in worldly matters. Thus, where Muslim countries have excelled in relative terms, say in Malaysia, the cause is partly attributed to Asian rather than to Islamic values. Similarly, the success of Turkey in transforming its economy is attributed to the modernization of its corporate culture along modern capitalist lines rather than to a particular Islamic quality of its economy or society. Dubai, the glittering emirate, which sees itself as the embodiment of the wired and globalized city, compares itself, if it ever does so anymore, to Singapore and Hong Kong, and not to some Islamic paradigm of success. Many Muslims feel that the modern West excludes Islam. The exclusion takes a variety of forms and feeds on the collapse in self-confidence which Muslims have undergone over the past 2 centuries. It involves the conscious erasure in the Western public mind of the interchange between Western civilization and Islam, which intersected in many times and places during the 7 centuries of Muslim rule over Spain, during the Ottoman expansion into southeastern Europe, and even during the Crusader states' interaction with their Muslim environment. There are, of course, vague reminders that medieval Christian theologians and philosophers were influenced by Muslim thinkers such as Averroes, or that the Muslims were the repositories and transmitters of ancient medieval knowledge. But the connection between that Islam and the modern day version is never acknowledged. Mostly the modern West, egged on by its cultural elites and the tabloid press, is horrified by any suggestion that Islam could contribute to the betterment of mankind or that it could have anything of note to say about the modern world and its path of development. What is so good about a backward faith which stones people, burns books, abuses women, and launches unprovoked attacks which kills thousands of innocent office workers? This is the core of the Western refusal to countenance a role for Islam on the world stage. Beyond the narrow recognition that there are a number of nation states which happen to be Muslim, and that perhaps a quarter of the world's population is Muslim, this blanket exclusion generates an equivalent response, at least from those Muslims who are exercised by what the rest of the world thinks of them, a fawning desire to be acknowledged as worthy of joining the club of civilized people and nations, or the angry rejection of those who had denied them respect. The former impulse drives the desire of the plutocrats of the Muslim world towards distorted imitation, obscene consumption and opulence, and the absurd attempts to acquire cultural status by importing wholesale campuses of Western universities or entire museums and their contents. The latter impulse drives the politics of resentment and envy, which at its edges feeds into nihilism and terrorism. Both have their roots in the desire for acknowledgement and respect. Such attitudes are also related to the question of power, specifically whether the kind of power that Islam wields has any relevance or significance to the modern world. The absence of a state champion on the global stage is ultimately related to the power that such a state can bring to bear. Behind all power, there is the element of force, real force, which can be applied to real situations to achieve real ends. Islam can only count in the world of global realpolitik if the power which emanates from it is capable of affecting outcomes to the advantage or at least not to the detriment of Muslims or Muslim countries. The world community, a euphemism for whichever state or group of states has the upper hand globally, has not been confronted so far with the need to accommodate the influence of Islam as expressed through a powerful state, notwithstanding the Iranian and to the lesser extent the Saudi claim to act on behalf of Islam. If anything, the revolutionary character of Islamic power as embodied by the Iranian state may never be recognized as a legitimate global expression of Islam. The Saudi claim to global Islamic authority is linked mainly to its power over oil and to the huge financial resources that this power can generate. It also helps the Saudis claim to privileged status that their country holds the site of Islam's two sacred cities, Mecca and Medina. So far, the Saudis, with only partial and very limited exception related to the war of October 1973, have not used their control over the world's largest source of oil to influence Western policies. In 1973, the Saudi under King Faisal, who was indeed motivated by pan-Islamic causes, embargoed the sale of oil to the US in retaliation for US support of Israel. It is inconceivable that the Saudis will ever use this weapon against in the support of Arab or Islamic causes. They are too entangled with their strategic alliance with the US to consider such a course, and they are frankly fearful of the US response. Have not shirked from using their oil power to assert their leadership claims within the Islamic world. But all else being equal, it is highly improbable that Saudi Arabia can ever rise to the ranks of global power on its own. However, it may do so if it succeeds in dominating the world of Sunni Islam through the latter's adoption of the tenets and worldview of Wahhabism. If that happens, then there will be a confluence between the interests of the Saudi state, representing some 30 million people, a small to medium power by any standard, and the world of Sunni Islam, some 1 billion strong. The rise of Saudi Arabia to global status can only take place if the hold of the traditional and moderate Sunni Islam on the loyalties of the world's Muslims is reduced. This is an ongoing struggle, and it is still unclear whether such an outcome is probable. But the immense wealth of Saudi state and the impoverishment of most Muslim societies might tip the scale in that direction. Many Muslim states such as Turkey, the Maliki countries of North Africa and Indonesia and will always hold out against Saudi Arabia's claim to undivided religious authority, but others such as Egypt and Pakistan succumb to the Wahhabization of their Islam. These two nations may provide the critical mass for the rise of Saudi Arabia to global status as the representative of most of Sunni Islam. An unwritten contract might even be struck between Saudi Arabia and Iran, whereby each would recognize the other as a representative of the world's Sunni and Shia Muslims, respectively, in preparation for the rise of both these states to the global power status. A further potential source of global power is represented by the enormous funds at the disposal of the small oil exporting countries of the Gulf. But these countries are even more hesitant than Saudi Arabia about using their resources to establish a position on behalf of the world of Islam. They are too small, too vulnerable, and too dependent on the military and security of the US ever to mount to a serious challenge. The kind of power that Islam may exert on the global scene is directly related to whether that power is connected to a state champion or whether it will be expressed in some other way. This is the authority which comes from the faith itself and from the fact that more than 1 billion Muslims adhere to it, and not to a powerful state actor which disposes of large military and economic resources. This type of power, moral authority, was the type that was contemptuously dismissed by Joseph Stalin. How many divisions does the Pope have? He was quoted as saying, "It is clear, though, that there is a basis and some reality to this form of intangible power. The demise of communism in Eastern Europe can be linked credibly to the deep involvement of the Catholic Church in the affairs of mass protest movements such as the Solidarity Trade Union of Poland." However, how far could this have succeeded without another more formidable alliance between the Church and the Reagan administration designed to undermine communism? Could it be then that the power of belief can only be expressed if it is harnessed alongside state actors? So, a state actor is, at present, a precondition for the admission to the world's upper reaches of power wielders. At the moment, Islam has no relevance in the actual division of the world into spheres of influence, control, or contestation. Non-state forces in the global order, for instance, impersonal financial and commodity markets, concentrations of wealth in private hands, and even transnational criminality have not reduced the significance or primacy of the state. It may very well be that the state falls under the increasing influence, if not control, of those who dispose of vast private assets, but the institutions of the modern state, especially its coercive force and its law-making functions, are still needed to project power. For the foreseeable future, therefore, state actors will continue to dominate the world stage. Far from being a credible mega power, Islam is treated as a disruptive force virtually synonymous with terrorism. The epithet Islamofascism, which is now loosely applied to the manifestation of terrorism, is in itself a loaded word, as it connects a repugnant ideology with an entire religion. The mobilization of world opinion against this form of terrorism has taken place at the expense of the image of the religion and civilization of Islam as a whole, notwithstanding the weak tokenistic assertions that terrorists only represents a fringe among Muslims. Islam cannot and should not be afforded a place in the global power system except and only if necessary in the form of a single nation state actors who happen to be Muslims. This, of course, carries a fundamental paradox. No Muslim present state can claim to be a global power, and no Muslim power can claim to act on behalf of Muslims unless it clearly represents a majority of Muslims. The fragmentation of Muslim states make them secondary actors to the larger powers. During the Cold War, a number of Muslim countries thought that, together with other non-Muslim developing countries, they could create a node of countervailing power in the form of the non-aligned movement. This was totally ineffective in creating a third way between the West and the Soviet bloc. Neither was the movement particularly concerned with reflecting specifically Muslim causes or advancing the reach of Islamic civilization. The successors to the non-aligned bloc, for instance, the idea of the South, the anti-globalization movement, or the environmental movement, make an uneasy fit with Islam, even though a number of causes of the espoused by these movements are held in common with Muslim countries and by a large number of individual Muslims. These movements operate at a second degree of power in the sense that they cannot themselves expect to control the global agenda. They can apply pressure and even be able to set part of the agenda, but they cannot be expected to define the world stage like the great powers or power blocks. They are also, to some extent, single-issue movements which can be expected to fade once their main concerns are absorbed into the mainstream of the global power politics. Climate change and environmental awareness are clear examples of causes which have gone this way.